welcome to the proffer. This is the St. Patrick's Day edition, we'll call it. We have the great T.J. English. Anybody who follows Irish organized crime in the United States of America will know him. He's written one of the most, without a doubt, the most sought-after book on Irish organized crime that I ever knew, which was the Westies. I think every cop I ever worked with read it. Every Irish kid I grew up with read it. And you've gone on to do so much more. And really happy that you're here today in beautiful church studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're out celebrating Irish Fest, and what a great opportunity to grab you for...
Yeah, well, great opportunity to meet you and to do this. Tulsa is a great place, and this whole festival is pretty unique. I mean, we owe it to a friend of ours, Danny Boy O'Connor, who's here in Tulsa. And I mean, he didn't put on the festival, but it's his unique vision that brought us together, because he was determined that if he was going to take part in this Irish festival, that he was going to bring his point of view, which was, you know, the streets, the criminal underworld, the dark side of the history of the Irish.
Yeah. So I was raised in the Bronx and later Lower Manhattan. NYPD family for generations. You found your way to New York how?
Oh, boy. I was born in Tacoma, Washington. In fact, I've been in New York so long now that people will instinctively ask me what part of the city I'm from. And I always say the West Side. And they say, where on the West Side? I say Tacoma, Washington. Yeah, and I went off to college in Los Angeles, so I was kind of a West Coast kid, but I always wanted to be in New York. I wanted to be in New York since I was about 14 or 15 years old. I'm not even sure why. It was maybe just the accumulation of movies and everything you see in the popular culture. I felt very drawn to come to New York. So I came to New York in '81 with $600 in my pocket, which you could do back then, you know, pre-gentrification. And I had this idea of being a writer, being a journalist. And but I had to pay the bill, so I was driving a cab. I drove a cab for 3 years in the '80s. At night, only at night.
Probably one of the most dangerous jobs in New York
especially at that time. Yeah, these were the crack cocaine years of the mid-'80s. It was wild. I drove a cab at night, but it was so great for me. It was my immersion into the city. It was my New York education of the streets. It's, in a funny way, it's the thing I'm most proud of, having done that.
I just had like a taxi driver flashback with you driving around the West Side in a dark, rainy night.
Travis Bickle. The romanticism of that. But you know what was so amazing about, you know this, because you're born and raised in it, others who come to New York, some figure this out and some never do. And that is, you have to have a certain swagger to function in New York. I don't care what your profession is or what you're doing. You have to have a certain swagger, because you're on the big stage. You're on the biggest of big stages when you're in New York, whatever it is you're pursuing. And taxi driving gave me my swagger. It connected me to the streets. It gave me a knowledge. It gave me the knowledge. It introduced me to the geography of the city, all 5 boroughs. I mean, that was incredibly valuable. You know, I could be watching a report on the news at night from somewhere way out in Brooklyn, and I would have a frame of reference for that neighborhood because I'd driven through there and I'd seen it. It made the city less intimidating to me. So all of that was drawing me into the city and giving me a point of view that I could even begin to think that I could tackle something like writing a book about the West Side Irish mob.
Wow.
You know, there's something that was so deeply ingrained. And believe me, I knew at the time the challenges of doing it, and I knew the history of it. I knew it was, to me, it was always a bigger story than just these neighborhood hoodlums that killed a bunch of guys. And it was more about the culture of that neighborhood, the criminal culture of that neighborhood,
Right.
and then the culture of the Irish in New York City and on the west side of Manhattan. And
Right.
so, yeah, it was a real privilege to be the guy who got to write that book.
Yeah. So, the Irish, when they began to emigrate to the United States, it was in these overwhelming numbers. They had suffered under the British. They didn't have there was no autonomy. The economy went down the tubes.
The famine.
The famine came, killed, God only knows what the real numbers
Yeah.
are. And this caused this, massive exodus to a small extent Europe, but everybody started to come to New York. But they were met with just as many problems
Right.
When they came here, between living in squalor, having, the mortality rate was, atrocious. Children and families living in these little hovels, and then getting drawn into like the gang culture. Started, I guess, downtown with, the Dead Rabbits and all
Five
those
Points.
guys, Five
Yeah.
Points gangs,
Yeah.
and you had like the Dead Rabbits versus the Eastman gang, the Jewish
Yeah.
gang, versus the Bowery Boys,
Yeah.
and who represented the old school. And so it was a real interesting time. But somewhere along the line, they have, and then two, draft riots,
Yeah.
Civil War.
Yep,
I mean,
yep.
talk about the worst time in the world to come to make this move.
We, us as Irish Americans, we're all children of the Irish potato famine. We are all descendants of the Irish potato famine. Right. The Irish were the first refugee class in the United States that arrived here in huge numbers without anything, with just the clothes on their back, in a state of extreme poverty. And as is often the case in these kind of situations, the powers that be were fucking terrified by this. It was all of a sudden the United States that was overrun with this starving refugee class, and it was seen as a crisis. And if you read the accounts of that era, there's a tremendous amount of vitriol and hatred and hostility directed towards this immigrant rabble, which was something that the founding fathers had probably never considered. Nobody had stopped to consider what happens when there's like a mass emigration of starving refugees. Well, how do we handle that? That was not, in the script. And so I think about it a lot because I wrote The Westies, but also another book called Paddywhacked, which is a sweeping history of the Irish American gangster. And it sort of begins with this history. And it answered a lot of questions for me because in the times that I've written about the criminal underworld in the United States, the traditional mob, Jews, Italians, Irish, I would always ask myself, why were the Irish so fucking crazy? Why did they have this reputation of basically self-destructive craziness in their DNA, I think the famine explains it. Yeah. To come over in that state of abject poverty, facing extinction, basically. Yeah. I mean, a third of the population died. It was an island of 3 million people. 1 million people died either from starvation or on those boats on the way over. They called the coffin ships. So those first generations of Irish Americans were the direct inheritors of that trauma.
And not to cut you off, but what's also interesting, since we are in Tulsa right now, talking about this, is the Trail of Tears ended here. Yeah. And right around this time, the Choctaw Nation actually got together, raised money to send to Ireland.
Yes. Yeah.
And it was a considerable sum of money at the time for people that that suffered just as greatly, which was just such a wonderful, gift and sign of solidarity.
What's so interesting about this is that there are a lot of Irish Americans, generations removed from the old country, who don't know this history at all, or have any understanding of it or appreciation of it. Some Irish in the United States, they just think they're white people. They don't really know. This is what's so valuable about bringing this front and center and including it in an Irish festival. And I mean, we're lucky to have Danny to think in these terms and to do this, because I think this is really relevant and important history for Irish Americans to know where we came from, you know?
And, you know, as hard as it was for them, in short order, they took over.
Right.
You know, I guess it starts with the formation of the Metropolitan, of the police department, modeled after the Metropolitan Police in London. And who's going to take these jobs?
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
so you have guys who have these terrible jobs of, you know, hard labor. You're getting sick, you're not getting paid for it, and now they get to put on a badge and
Yeah.
wear it with pride, and in great numbers.
Yeah.
And then I guess they also come up through the ranks where they eventually take over Tammany Hall.
Politics.
So the McManus family started their dynasty in politics by taking over
Right.
Tammany Hall, and then. I guess what's also, and I'm just going to say one more thing to it, is gangsters like Oni Madden now came to the scene, and, you know, they came to power in the West Side,
Yeah.
which was going to eventually be called Hell's Kitchen. There's a lot of stories how it got named. You might know the real one, who knows? But,
Yeah.
but that, I think, was those three things happening
Yeah.
really changed.
Well, the Irish had one advantage, and it was a big advantage. They spoke English.
Right.
So here was this teeming
Right.
immigrant class of people from all over Eastern Europe and all over the globe, and the Irish spoke English. And so I think, and they had the gift of gab. And so I think what happened is others amongst the immigrant class sort of designated the Irish to be our spokespeople for the immigrant class, for the working man, all that stuff. The Irish were kind of elevated in that sense in the political structure. Yeah, they took over Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was started by WASPs.
Right.
WASP businessmen in Philadelphia. And the Irish were the ones that kind of saw it as a vehicle to create power into the political process and get people elected and sort of reconfigure the direction of the United States.
Right. And wasn't it Thomas McManus
Yeah.
unseated George Washington Plunkett, I
Yes,
think.
yes.
So if an Irishman is, not only is he taking control of the Protestant-controlled,
Yeah.
you know, political hierarchy, it's by a guy named George Washington Plunkett. I mean,
Yeah.
so it's really amazing, and it's a short period of time. It's
Yeah,
not,
well, and then, as you mentioned, the McManus family goes on to control the Midtown Democratic Club, a very powerful local political organization in Manhattan. That family controls that organization for the next 100 years
Right.
or so. And in the story of that family and its relationship to the neighborhood, including the criminal element in the neighborhood, really is the story of the Irish American gangster and why the Irish mob had the kind of power that it did. It was because of its connections to these levers of social power that the other groups maybe didn't have that level of access to.
Right.
Now, the Italians come along after the Irish, and they bring a criminal tradition called the mafia that we all think we know about. And they have an organizational structure that the Irish never could quite get together, the organizational aspect of it. I've had some wonderful conversations with Irish American gangsters about that, about why there was never a kind of organizational structure, particularly a guy who's become a great source for me named Pat Nee, who was a gangster from Boston, who was kind of both a rival and a partner of Whitey Bulger's in his years there. Pat was born in Galway, came to Boston as a young guy. We'd talk about it a lot, and he said, you know, the thing was the Irish gangster had no respect for institutional authority. And so they kind of had an aversion to submitting to that system where there was this hierarchy and someone was going to tell you what to do. And the Irish could never respect that bosses would have underlings go do the dirty work, the killings and whatnot. Right. They looked down on that. That was like, you're not man enough to do it yourself, which is kind of interesting because, I mean, Whitey Bulger was strangling people to death with his bare hands up until he was like 65. Right. The Irish never figured out that you could get, you know, people lower on the pecking order to go do those crimes for you. Right. And then you wouldn't have to go to jail. You maybe could avoid all the the consequences of an act like that. So that was a main difference between the Irish and the Italians.
Yeah, and when Oni Madden comes to power, I guess the West Side at the time had the railroad yard started to get big. The docks started to grow. So you had all these jobs. They weren't high-paying jobs, but people moved into tenements, set up shanties, real poor underclass. And with that, obviously, there are some Irish gangs. I think there was the Gopher Gang, the Hudson Dusters. Yeah. But there's a war for control, and Oni Madden comes out ahead, and he's a violent guy, but he's also a bit of a dandy and whatever. And he now we have prohibition. Yes. And he takes advantage of prohibition and just goes on to do these amazing things.
Well, West Side of Manhattan. The West Side of Manhattan in the early part of the 20th century was kind of like the gateway to the world. Everything was coming through those West Side docks. Goods from all over the globe were coming in, cargo ships coming into the West Side of Manhattan, and then right from the cargo ships onto the rails, around the country. So it was an incredibly vital piece of real estate in the commercial life of not only New York, but in the entire United States. And there was, tons of labor there, unloading the ships, all levels of labor going on there. And it was all controlled by, controlled. Criminal elements always had a piece of it. And if they didn't have a piece of it, then they robbed. The Gophers were basically a waterfront pilfering and robbery gang, that raided the docks and stole stuff off the cargo ships and everything. And Oni Madden rose up out of that. And he was incredibly violent. He killed something like 5 people by the time he was 22, 23 years old. And he got sent away to prison for a while. And he came out of prison right in the middle of Prohibition, or in the early years of Prohibition. And I think he was smarter than a lot of street hoodlums in the sense that he did think, I'm not going to go back to prison again. Right. And the way I'm going to do that is by assuming a position of control and an organization, and he actually, so he makes all his money. He was maybe the biggest bootlegger in the United States of America at that time, because the West Side of Manhattan became his base, and there was a distillery on 24th Street and 8th Avenue that was the largest booze distillery in the United States. His product was called Madden's Number One, and it was the booze that everybody drank in New York during those years. He had a whole platoon of cops that for security for that distillery, so the NYPD was in on it. I mean, the whole system of government was in on it. It's a fascinating thing because, unlike, let's say, cocaine, alcohol had been legal for a long time before they banned it. And a lot of people drank alcohol. And so they were banning something that was hugely popular product. And they knew that. They had to have known that. Yeah. It was kind of the hubris of thinking, well, we're just going to declare it illegal and everyone's going to stop drinking. That's not what happened. It was kind of the opposite of that. People created this elaborate organized crime structure to feed that one racket.
And Oni Madden, I believe, was actually a smart kid who skipped some grades, got a scholarship to, I think, Rice High School, one of those, and his father died. Has to quit school, take care of mom. Yeah. So, these are the things where, there might be a lot about it that we don't know, but obviously that's what drove him to organized crime, at least in the moment.
And also when he became a gangster in the roaring 20s, he was the owner of the Cotton Club. Yeah. He owned a piece of a bunch of heavyweight prize fighters.
Right. I think he had some affiliation with Jack Johnson.
Well, he bought the Cotton Club from Jack Johnson. Right. Racehorses, thoroughbred racehorses. He's one of the first guys that diversified his money. And he reinvented himself. He's kind of like a Great Gatsby character
Yeah.
of the underworld. The dandy you talk about, all that stuff, he kind of adopted that. You know, Hell's Kitchen is, for those who don't know, is right next to the theater district in New York. And there was a whole Broadway culture at that time, you know, where the gangsters and a lot of Broadway show people kind of interacted at a restaurant called Lindy's where they would all hang out.
And you know what I was thinking too is,
Yeah.
is that if you think about the Cotton Club, you know, guys like Louis Armstrong were there, Lena Horne.
Yeah.
I mean, you could go on, like all these films we've seen, you know, with the little doors sliding open,
Yeah.
knowing the password. I mean, this is something that this is what Oni ran and made popular. He brought like a certain chic to this whole thing
Yeah.
too, where those people who had money felt like they were out, you know, on some kind of lark, having fun, and I guess they liked the little danger of it too.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. I just published a book a couple years ago called Dangerous Rhythms, Jazz in the Underworld. It's the history of jazz and its connection to organized crime.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and a lot of it is this era of, once that connection was established, like what's hip and cool, that's what jazz was. It was hip and cool. You connect that to the criminal underworld. So the criminal underworld's supplying booze, which is a big part of that hip, cool jazz world. That created a template for the criminal world. I mean, the cocaine era is just another version of that, you know? Right. If you can take a criminal racket and connect it to a cultural phenomenon that's like exploding in popularity, you can make a lot of money.
Yeah. Well, and now I guess there comes a time now where things start to change. The Italian mob now is getting big. They're chasing after guys like Dutch Schultz, trying to take control.
Yeah.
And I guess things start going bad for Oni in that, you know, you can't stay on top forever.
Right.
Unless you want to go to battle, go to war. And I think that once you reap the benefits of success, you don't want to go back down there. And eventually, you know, and I'm leaving a lot out, but eventually he's run out of town.
Yeah.
And he ends up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, of all places, a town known for its corrupt police and government. And he ends up, I think he starts a club there, if I'm not mistaken, a little gambling club. And, you know, Lucky Luciano ends up on the lam out there. And I think the marshals grabbed him and brought him back east. But he ends up living out his life, which is a rarity, to live out your life as a mobster with a little bit of coin and not having to look over your shoulder. So Oni's story is a success only in that he really kind of left the mob and took something.
He got out of it in a way.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, Prohibition ended in 1933 after a 13-year run, and that changed the landscape a lot. And I think he looked at it and said, first of all, he didn't have the soldiers to go to war. This is one of the big differences between the Italians and the Irish at this point. The Irish did not have an organizational structure with soldiers. They didn't have that mafia tradition. And so they weren't going to win a war with the Italians. There was a few cases where wars sprung up, and the Irish were crazy enough. I mean, this is kind of the story of the Westies. The Irish were crazy enough to create a path for themselves, but they were never going to have the structure that the mafia had, you know, like families with sub-families in all the different cities around the United States. I mean, the Irish didn't have that.
And connections back to the old country.
They weren't going to have that. And Oni Madden was smart enough to see that, and he said, I'm going to get out of this game, sort of get out. I mean, so he goes to Hot Springs, and he becomes kind of a political power broker there. Semi-retired in terms of his criminal activities, but a guy who could use his juice and his influence and his stature to negotiate things.
His New York swagger.
His New York swagger. He brought it with him,
So, and then now Huey Mulligan kind of steps in.
Yeah.
We don't have prohibition, so we have to earn our money different ways. So I guess it's the usual, the gambling kind of rackets, the numbers, the protection money, the loans, that type of thing.
Unions.
Unions.
Exploitation of unions was access to a lot of money.
And maybe the West Side was spared the Italian mafia too because of the McManus political organization
Big
too. I
part
would
of it.
assume.
Yeah, good point. I mean, the West Side of Manhattan, particularly Hell's Kitchen, was kind of conceded to the Irish because they were there first, and they held historical precedence there. And for a while, that was tremendous for the Irish because that was a very lucrative terrain. But the docks started to die out in the years after World War II. Airplane cargo planes, highways all around the United States kind of took away from the waterfront as the preeminent mode of commercial transport. And so that whole way of life started to die out.
Right.
And you mentioned Huey Mulligan. He was there, and an underling of his who kind of rose to become boss, a guy named Mickey Spillane, not the writer.
Right.
But his name was Mickey Spillane. He took over in the 60s. But each generation was dwindling. It was dwindling and dwindling. And so this is kind of what the Westies were left with. They were left with a tradition that had been around for a long time, that was respected in the criminal underworld in New York City, even by the Italians. But there weren't a lot of economic opportunities related to it. And the Irish, as an organization, never really got involved in drugs much. I've never heard of them like having a rule against it or anything like they say about the mafia sometimes. But they just didn't get into it. I think they felt like that's not we don't know that market,
So Mickey Spillane, I guess, he's similar to Huey Mulligan in some ways, but he's also more violent. He does a robbery when he's young, 17, 18 years old, gets shot by a cop or something.
There's a great photo of him sprawled on the street.
And he ends up, though.
He kidnaps a mafiosi.
Yeah, well, and then I guess one of the more important things, too, is he marries into the McManus family. So I guess that was a great opportunity, maybe get a little protection here and there.
That was a big day for the neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen when the daughter of the political leader marries the mob boss in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
That was in the 60s. And I think at the time it looked like it was this glorious thing where we're going to rule the roost here in Hell's Kitchen. But it didn't change the fact that all the rackets were kind of dwindling and dying out.
Right.
And so that's what Mickey Spillane was faced with. And he had this thing of keeping the Italians out of the neighborhood. That this is the Irish, and keep them out.
Right.
And the big challenge to that was a massive convention center called the Jacob Javits Convention Center.
Right.
Was going to be built on the west side of Manhattan.
It's a massive trade show for people that don't know, and
the biggest in the country at that time.
Right.
And in New York, a construction project like that brings with it all these criminal rackets that are sort of connected to it, beginning with the construction of the building and like who's going to get the contracts, the cement contract, the window contract, who's going to get to have control over the food carts that sell coffee to the workers, coffee and donuts to the worker every morning. There's money to be made in that kind of stuff.
Then the unions, obviously, who's going to the unions that are building, and then the unions like the carpenters unions who are going to basically build and take down every exhibit that comes in there. So
it was a feeding frenzy for that structure. When it was even before it was built, there were a bunch of murders connected to the underworld buying for control over who was going to be in on the ground floor of that project.
Yes. So, and two of the big families that were interested were the Genovese family and the Gambino family. And at this time, too, now, you have these young Turks coming up now. Jimmy Coonan, Mickey Featherstone, and all the other guys in their entourage. They now want to take control. Mickey is not somebody who, well, one, he's a little bit classier than they are, for sure. And he has his, and he's not worried about feeding his organization. He has a smaller group of guys, or old school guys. And so now you have Fat Tony Salerno from the Jennings family, who's looking to get rid of Mickey. and you have, and then you have guys like Jimmy Coonan, who are no big fans of Fat Tony, but they're willing to make, a pact with the Gambino family. But I guess what's going on now is members of Mickey's crew are getting killed. And, what is he going to do?
Yeah. Well, members of Coonan's crew were getting killed.
Okay.
Coonan being the boss. So, yeah, you're right. What happens there, and just to put this in historical context, we're talking about the late 70s on into the 80s when all this is happening. So this is many decades after Oni Madden. But it's, like I say, the inheritors of that tradition. And so the Irish, this generation you're talking about that became known as the Westies, they kind of took over. They moved Mickey Spillane aside, and they took over the neighborhood. So this is the 70s generation.
Right.
And they're drinkers. And they're drug users. This is post-Vietnam. This is a darker period of time. And New York is in decay all around them, and Hell's Kitchen in particular is in economic decay. The city goes bankrupt in 76 or so.
Right.
And it's just this era of kind of doom in New York.
The famous Post headline, Ford to City, drop dead. I think is it.
Yeah, this is a very dark period in New York City. And I don't know if they're related, but it also happens to be the time that the use of dismemberment becomes a thing in New York. Not just the Westies who became known for it, but there was a crew of the Gambino family based in Brooklyn that also got into this thing of cutting up bodies and making the bodies disappear. So there were a lot of fucking bodies being killed and cut up in New York in the late 1970s and dumped in the rivers.
Yeah. And so I'm just going to read some names of Jimmy Coonan's crew. So number one has to be Mickey Featherstone.
Right.
That's his right-hand man for many years. There's Richie Ryan, who's real crazy. Jimmy McElroy, Billy Beatty. Then you got Eddie, the Coonan brother, other Coonan brothers, Eddie Coonan, Jackie Coonan, and Kevin Kelly and Kenny Shannon.
Yeah.
Those, I guess, would be kind of the core.
That's the core.
Yeah. And so
it was a small group. I mean, there were never more than like 12 guys.
And then you had Eddie Comiskey, who was learned to be a butcher in prison.
He's the one who started it all. He trained to be a butcher in prison, and when he got out, he brought this skill back to the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And he trained Jimmy Coonan on how to cut up a body.
Yeah.
And which is obviously a gruesome thing. Although you're a cop, so you were a cop. So I've talked to cops about this a lot. Were you ever in for an autopsy?
Yes.
So you saw
Yeah, I was a detective.
when they would cut the face and move it.
Yeah. I didn't go to a lot of autopsies, maybe 5 or 6, but they are gruesome.
Now, do you get training for how to handle that when you?
No, it's just go in and do it. They talked about it in the academy, I guess. They talked about it in detective school, CIC school. But until you go into the morgue and you get that whiff of death, do you realize what it's just amazing.
I talked to some cops who told me they lost their lunch the first time because they'll cut along the face and then move the face back. I mean, it's
the smell. I think is the worst.
The smell
part.
is what makes people nauseous.
Yeah, and the MEs, to them it's nothing. And one thing I found is when they're talking about the decedent and the process and things they're doing, and they're telling you things.
Yeah.
You hear
clinical.
Nothing. You hear absolutely nothing. All you can think about is the gruesomeness of it, the smell of it, and that smell will remain in your nostrils for a day or two. It's horrible.
Okay, but what happens with cops and the doctors is you become immune to it after a while.
Right.
It becomes commonplace and it doesn't bother you anymore. And maybe you even start to, I don't want to say like it necessarily, but you start to become fascinated by it. You're noticing little details that you didn't even notice at first because you were so shocked by it all. It was kind of like that with the Westies. Featherstone described, now Featherstone, who never took to the dismemberment. He puked the first time he was asked to do it. He thought it was disgusting. He never quite got the hang of it in the way that Jimmy Coonan did, and some other members of the gang did. But his thing always was like, yeah, you're going to find it absolutely overwhelmingly disgusting the first time or two that you experience it. But if this is the method of the group, and it's going to happen again and again and again, and you're going to be privy to it on numerous occasions, after a while you become what the average person would consider to be very cold-hearted about it.
Do you think that the Westies learned from Roy DeMeo or taught him, or they just acted independently of each other?
It's actually just a coincidence that those two groups
found
were
each other
doing that at the same time. Now, being the writer, I'm gonna make a supposition here, and that is the violence of New York starting in the late 70s. Killings, bodies left around, with the economic decay of the city, with the sort of gloom and doom, the introduction of drugs, cocaine, heroin. This hit Hell's Kitchen really hard in the 70s. They kind of collectively reached a place where the depravity almost was in sync with the environment, the physical environment at that time. It was a dark time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that and the fact that Jimmy Coonan, as I mentioned when we were talking before, had a philosophy which was no corpus delicti, no investigation. You got to remember, this was the pre-DNA era.
Right.
If you could make a body disappear, it was virtually impossible to have a homicide investigation.
Right. And these guys were, a lot of the homicide, not a lot, but a good number of homicides that they were involved in were beefs that happened in bars and things too. There was a lot of, all right, I'll be right back with my gun, And
it was craziness.
Yeah.
It was that energy. I just this afternoon before we sat down here, I was over at the Bob Dylan Center here in Tulsa, which is such a great facility. And I'm lucky that at the same time they have an exhibit about Shane MacGowan and the Pogues.
Right.
Now you listen to the Pogues music, that demented, crazy, kind of traditional Irish meets punk rock.
Right.
That's the mentality that we're talking about that existed in those bars at that time in the 70s and on into the 80s. Just a kind of wild.
Yeah, you were in danger in those bars.
Yeah.
If you, God forbid, you stepped on the wrong toe.
Yeah, anyone who's been to Northern Ireland, has been to places like Belfast or Derry, they know that vibe when you walk into a bar and everything goes quiet and everyone's looking at you like, who's this guy?
Now, so I know Mickey Spillane was known for it, and then later on, Coonan and crew, they would kidnap like Shylocks and mobsters and ransom them off. Which is really ballsy, incredibly ballsy to take an Italian mobster who has an army. Why do you think they got away with that for so long? Do you think
the Italians did it too?
Did they?
I mean, it was just this crazy thing in the underworld that you would just snatch a guy from another crew and say, give me a bunch of money or we're not going to release him.
Right.
It seemed kind of wild and desperate to me, and it was not uncommon.
Right.
And usually the money was paid. It was sort of a protocol that they just all went through. You got the guy, okay, how much you want? It was kind of just the course of daily events kind of thing. It was only when Spillane kidnapped this guy named Eli Zaccardi, who was a big loan shark at the
Genovese
time.
guy, I think.
Yeah. And he got killed.
Yeah.
He got killed.
Yeah, he left his house in Jersey, I think, and he was supposed to head down to Cafe Rome or one of those places down on Broome Street, and he never made it.
Now, that was a big thing. That's funny because none of that ever made the newspapers.
Right.
This is why we call it the underworld, It happened in the underworld. And this is, pre the Godfather movies, so it's like nobody really knew what was going on. These names weren't known. Eli Zaccardi was not a name that was known. And for that matter, neither was Mickey Spillane. So he disappears, he gets killed, and now the mafia wants to take care of Spillane. They want to move him out. They want to take him out.
Right.
And they eventually do take him out. They kill him. He had been so terrorized in Hell's Kitchen that he moved his family across the river,
right?
East River, to Queens.
Right.
And they got him one night there.
Right.
I got an amazing account of that from his son, who was just a child at the time.
Was that Bobby or
Bobby
Michael?
Spillane, who
Yeah.
was probably about 10 years old at the time. Somebody pushed the intercom on the apartment, and he answered it, and he came. He said, "Dad, there's somebody here for you." And Dad went to the intercom, and whoever that voice was on the intercom was a friendly voice, because he said, "Mickey, we want to see you down here." Mickey says to his son, hand me my coat. I'm going to go downstairs. I'll be back in 5 minutes. And he went down to that car that was waiting for him, and they shot him dead. So he was lured into that by somebody close to him.
So, so that was in May of 77.
Yeah.
In May of 77, my family we were packing boxes to move from the Bronx to Lower Manhattan, and I was to attend St. Agnes Boys High School the following year on 44th Street. As a kid in the Bronx, in a neighborhood on the decline, and and like we said, everything that was going wrong in New York City, you could feel it.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of like, wow, this is going to be great. I'm moving to Manhattan. And I never thought anything like this existed in Manhattan. I just knew skyscrapers, nice buildings. We'd go out to some kind of event that was nice and like a fond memory of it. And when I ended up in St. Agnes High School, I got schooled by some of the kids from Chelsea who we would ride up on the bus together going to school. And I became aware that my classmates, who would be, in different years, but I guess it was Bobby and Michael Spillane, who were sons. There was also Timmy Spillane. And then several other kids from the West Side were that, like, these kids are the real deal. You do not want to hang out with them. And and then the other side of the high school was like UN kids. So you had the Westies and the UN kids, but everyone looked like had these, cherubics,
Yeah.
innocent looking faces, but had no idea what they were going home to. And I think at that point, that the Spillane kids ended up moving back to the West Side.
Yeah, Bobby did.
I think they got one of those apartments in those newer buildings down on like
Manhattan
43rd.
Plaza.
Right.
Yes.
So anyway, but that happens because there's a famous incident where Paul Castellano calls for Jimmy Coonan to come and break bread and discuss the future of their relationship with the West Side and the Westies. So what do you know about that?
Well, first of all, all this you're mentioning about that neighborhood, what people need to know is by the 70s and 80s, when the Westies really were emerging as players, that whole culture of the Irish mobster was a thing of the past for the most part. The Irish mob had kind of assimilated by then. The Irish in general had assimilated by then. They moved in New York, they moved to the island, Long Island, or to Westchester County, or to New Jersey. Right. They kind of moved up in the world and assimilated and no longer needed this criminal culture. So the Westies were a kind of weird throwback to the Jimmy Cagney era.
Right.
I mean, they all sounded and kind of looked like Jimmy Cagney, and they were like forgotten by time. It was like the land that time forgot. It was because of the traditional roots of Hell's Kitchen in the organized crime criminal structure. It lasted longer. It lasted way past its expiration date.
Right.
And so that's what I felt when I first started to explore this culture. I was like, wow, this is like the lost tribe of the Irish, the last of the last of a certain kind of hard-ass, tough, Irish-American mentality that you could trace back to the potato famine, know? That kind of hard-scrabble survivalist mentality. The Westies had that. Yeah, so in the late 70s, Mickey Spillane gets killed, and Jimmy Coonan makes his move, and he takes out a well-known loan shark named Ruby Stein.
Right. So Ruby Stein was a guy who he was basically a Shylock and
Yeah.
a guy who ran numbers and gambling spots.
Yeah. Well, he was a loan shark. Period.
Right.
He was
Okay.
called the loan shark to the stars.
Okay.
Because he was a high level loan shark.
Right.
And Jimmy Coonan started out as his muscle.
To protect him from Spillane, I would guess, too, right?
From just anybody, you
Right.
know, just like who knows. So Jimmy Coonan waxed Ruby Stein. This was kind of a shocking play on his part. They lure him to a bar in Hell's Kitchen, and they bring him in, close the door behind him, and right away he knows, and they come out and they shoot him. And they turn it into a kind of ritual. Jimmy, even after Ruby Stein's been shot dead, Jimmy Coonan hands the gun. 4 or 5 of the Westies are around, and they hand the gun, and each of them put a bullet into the already dead body of Ruby Stein. I guess that's a bonding ritual. It also maybe was a way to implicate all of them.
Right.
Now they're part and parcel of the murder, and they cut up the body.
Right.
And they dump it. And now Paul Castellano of the Gambino family, the largest mafia family based in Brooklyn, is concerned that these West Side Irish guys are out of control and they're making moves. And they just took out Ruby Stein, who's the golden goose. They just took out the golden goose.
Right.
And you know the issue was his book with his names of who he loans money to and
Right.
how much is owed to him. We didn't have computers.
valuable.
We didn't have computers then. So this was like a little book where it was all written with a pencil, you
Right.
know. And so Jimmy had that book. And I was like, don't let anyone get this book. The book was valuable.
And I'm sure Jimmy owed him a lot of money, too.
Probably. It wasn't so much about money.
I heard he had a decent debt to him. And then
Probably.
obviously the value of that book, taking it over
book.
and making collections on it.
When they got called out to Brooklyn to have a sit down with Paul Castellano and all the heads of the families, just Mickey Featherstone and Jimmy Coonan go out there. That's the first thing Castellano asked, where's the book? And Jimmy's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Jimmy stalled and denied and didn't admit to the murder. And then Castellano said, well, look, you guys can't be operating as the wild, independent thing where you kill people whenever you want to. He said, so what we're going to offer you is to bring you into our organization. And that means you get a piece of what we're doing. You have access to our money flow. But that means you got to check with us. You can't kill people without it being authorized. You're a member of the organization. Right. And Coonan was all for that. Some of the other members in the gang were not all for that. This created a rift that eventually would bring about the end of the Westies.
Right.
But I think Coonan realized that Hell's Kitchen was dying out as a criminal domain, and that if they were going to survive, they had to come up with economic possibilities that were beyond what the neighborhood could offer them. And so Coonan just saw it as the smart thing to do, to merge with this larger corporation. And it's going to be great for us. But the others were like, no, that's a betrayal of who we are. And
Right.
yeah.
But you got to go along with it if you want to.
Well, it's an interesting philosophical thing, you know, that you confront about where's your loyalty? You know, what is your loyalty to? Is it to the bottom line, the money, or is it to the brotherhood of our group and our community?
And they're basically assigned to do business with Roy DeMeo's crew, is their go-to crew.
Yeah, the other most homicidal
Right.
group in the city.
If not a straight-out serial killer.
Yeah, a lot of bodies. They had a place out in Brooklyn where they cut up their bodies, and it was really a chamber of horrors out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that era even existed.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it was Roy DeMeo was responsible for Mickey Spillane's murder.
Yes.
So
yeah, as a gift to Jimmy Coonan.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting times. You know, and the other, here's an interesting sub-story to this. So when the mafia decides that they want to get rid of Mickey Spillane and that he needs to go, he's an impediment, they hire a freelance hitman named Mad Dog Sullivan, Joseph Mad Dog Sullivan,
Right.
who I got to know pretty well. I went and met him in prison a couple times and interviewed him in prison. This was an old school hitman for the mob.
Yeah.
There was just a fascinating guy, very well read, I guess because he'd been incarcerated. By the time I met him, he'd been in prison for 32 or 33 years. He was never going to get out. He died in prison. He was the most appealing, likable guy you'd ever meet. And, chatty, a lot of personality. He had that Irish gift of gab, very friendly. Hey, call me Sully, call me Sully. And I remember talking to him in the prison visiting room, and he's describing one of his hits and how he went into a bar. So I'm getting ahead of myself. The mafia hires him to start taking out members of Spillane's crew.
Right.
I guess to deliver a message, because they don't just kill Spillane, they start killing his closest associates. But Sullivan explained it to me that he had a list, and Coonan and Featherstone were on that list also. He never got around to that, but he was supposed to.
Wow.
So he starts taking out 3 or 4 series of murders over a year and a half that are close to Mickey Spillane. That's when Mickey Spillane knew he had to get out of the neighborhood. He could see that they were taking out his entire organization.
Right.
And this guy, Mad Dog Sullivan, was doing those hits. So when I met him and I was like, he was describing the different hits to me. And one of them took place one of them was Eddie Comiskey.
Right.
He whacked Eddie Comiskey, the guy who showed everybody how to cut up bodies. And he whacked him right in his favorite neighborhood bar called the Sunbright Saloon on 10th Avenue. How'd you do it? Well, I put dark makeup on, so I looked kind of Hispanic or, at least not overtly Irish. And I went in and I sat at the bar, and it was like 4 or 5 o'clock, heading right into rush hour. And Eddie Comiskey comes in and sits down at the bar next to me. And he said, I started chatting with him. I started making small talk with him. The topic of discussion, it was 1976. So the bicentennial was happening. And all the tall ships had come into the port of New York, and it was a big show.
Yeah.
And they were talking about that, what a big thing that was for the neighborhood. And he talks to him for about 20 minutes. He waits till Eddie Comiskey is totally disarmed and relaxed. And then the easiest thing in the world, he takes out a gun, puts it to his head, and pulls the trigger.
Wow.
And he drops the gun, he backs up, and he goes out the door. And everyone's in such shock that they can't really. The identifications were very inconclusive about who the gunman was, what he looked like, and all that stuff. Anyways, Mad Dog Sullivan's telling me this story, and it dawned on me, nice guys make the best killers.
Right.
Nice guys make the best killers.
Yeah.
If you can disarm somebody,
Right.
be friendly, relax them.
Not a threat. Yeah.
Boom. That was the secret of his style as a hitman.
Yeah.
Fascinating guy, really, really wild. He died not that long ago, about 5 years ago. He died in prison. But he kind of, I don't want to say, he regretted stuff. At least this is what he told me. He knew that he deserved to be in prison and never get out.
Didn't he have a relationship with a woman who didn't know what he was all about? Was that?
I think she knew.
Do you?
They were together up until the day he died. She never left him.
Wow.
They were married for like 40 years, and she stayed with him through the whole thing. Amazing. I met her too. She says that initially she didn't know, that she thought he was in labor, union work. That's probably what he told her.
Right.
But I don't know if she really believed that or she sort of allowed herself to believe that.
Right.
His problem was cocaine. Cocaine had a big impact on the criminal underworld starting in the late 70s into the 80s. I mean, cocaine just kind of could make people demented in a way.
Yeah.
If you mix
Cocaine
the alcohol.
psychosis.
Yeah, you mix the alcohol with the cocaine. Cocaine pushes you into a place of spontaneity. I mean, you kind of react to shit without thinking. That's what happens when you're high on coke. That's what I hear anyway. I wouldn't. And so all those guys were cokeheads. They were coming from a whiskey drinking culture to begin with, and then you add the cocaine to that, and it was just out of control.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about Comiskey as the butcher. I believe it was Ruby Stein. They ended up finding his torso because they forgot to puncture his lungs.
This is the anecdote people remember about this book more than any other for some reason. This about the torso and forgetting to puncture the lungs.
Yeah. And what was the fascination that they had? Because I don't believe for a second it could possibly work, but they used to chop the hands off of their victims and put them in freezer.
I don't know if they ever actually did that.
You think that's just folklore? Or?
There's a lot of folklore about the Westies. And what made it difficult to research was I would hear stories that were like that or stories that were like really outrageous. Now, some of the things that are verified are equally outrageous. So you kind of had to assume that almost anything you heard could be true. Right. For instance, I'll tell you one that is verifiable that I think is even worse. When they killed a guy and cut off his genitalia, his balls and his penis, and put it in an empty milk carton and took the carton down to the bar where he used to hang out and dumped it out on the bar.
That's
That's even a little bit sicker than the than the fingers and the hands.
It's in bad taste, to say the least.
And that did happen. And heads in sacks. They took a head. They'd killed a guy and they were carrying his head down the stairs to bury him in the basement of the tenement. And one of the niece, young 13, 14-year-old niece, looked out, and there's Jimmy Coonan and a couple of the other guys, and they're carrying what looked like a basketball in a bag, and they're like, "Go back inside." Yeah. That was the neighborhood at that time. So I heard about the severing of hands. Coonan had the idea that they were going to take hands, preserve them, and then use the fingerprints and plant them on murder.
Which I don't think is possible without
I don't know if it would work.
The oils that you would need to
transfer. I'm not sure it would work.
Right.
But it does sound like the kind of thing you'd come up with, in barroom conversation to think, that's brilliant, Jimmy.
It's a what if that none of us would actually ever try to carry out.
Gee, why didn't I think of that?
What did you think of, did you ever have an opportunity to talk to Jimmy Coonan?
No, he would not talk to me.
Any of his family members? I know his wife actually was arrested too at the end.
Yeah, she did. She got a
15 years.
I think it was a 15-year sentence. I hear she was kind of traumatized by all that because she didn't quite know. I mean, I'm sure she knew she was a tough broad. She was a tough lady. Edna Fitzgerald was her name. But I don't know if she knew the extent of the murders and dismemberments and all that stuff. And that all came out in the trial. And I hear she was kind of shocked by the whole thing. She did her time. Yeah.
What did you think? So I guess probably the most popular Westie would be Mickey Featherstone. He had, his name was always out there as, it was kind of like a cool Irish mob name, old school Mickey, and he had a reputation about it to be a guy who would just kill anybody he wanted, fly off the handle, grab a gun, go into a bar, shoot up the bar for no reason other than some Vietnam vet. And what do you know about Mickey? I know you've spoken to him a lot. What do you think of him? What do you think his?
I couldn't have. First of all, I owe him a debt of gratitude, because I couldn't have done that book the way it was done if he had not been as open with me as he was. And I wasn't paying him. I think I caught him at a time, he had just gone through a long period of debriefing as they prepared him to testify at the trial.
Well, and you know what? Let's back it up one second. So there's a beef. One of the Boken brothers gets killed. I forget which one.
Yeah.
And who killed him? It's
Michael Hawley, they thought.
Michael Hawley gets into a fight with one of the Bokens.
Yeah.
And an off-duty cop comes. Hawley gets shot, survives, but an off-duty cop walks in and kills Boken. So it was kind of one of those things where I think they always
It's a
wanted.
good memory. I don't even remember all
Yeah,
that.
they wanted to get even.
They
with
blamed
him.
Holly for it.
Absolutely, and it was
Yeah.
it was a fight that
Yeah.
escalated
Barroom
outside,
bullshit.
and it ends up with Boken getting killed by an off-duty cop. And so Holly was marked,
Yeah.
but it was one of those things. There wasn't any urgency to it.
Yeah.
But they decide to kill Holly, and the word was someone put a wig on to do the hit.
Yeah.
And Featherstone took it as if they arrested Mickey Featherstone for it,
Yeah.
because the wig would make him appear like Mickey.
Yeah.
And some people would, Mickey would, I think, believe is that they deliberately set him up by
Oh,
doing
yeah.
that.
Yes.
And
That Coonan set him up.
that causes Mickey to say, hey, this is not what I signed
Yeah.
up for. And so let's just start there. That's Mickey.
Well,
now
that's-
he's played along. He
Yeah.
was a good soldier.
Yeah.
And he turned down hits. He was getting sick of the life.
Oh, yeah. That's a big part of this story, how it all comes to an end, because it starts with this disagreement over, are we going to go with the Italians or are we going to stay on our own? And that creates factions within the Westies, the Coonan faction and the Featherstone faction. And Featherstone becomes increasingly more disenchanted with the whole thing, and he's kind of trying to get out. And he's let it be known. And so now you've got dissension between Coonan and Featherstone. And the theory is the killing of Michael Hawley. Michael Hawley, by this time, was a laborer at the Jacob Javits Convention Center. He's working on the construction of that building, and it happens in the middle of the day on the lunch break. Car pulls up, gunman jumps out and shoots him. The gunman's wearing he's got hair, sandy blonde hair like Featherstone.
Right.
He's disguised to look like Mickey Featherstone.
Right.
And in fact, after the murder occurs and they arrest Featherstone, he's put in a lineup and he's picked out of the lineup as the gunman. And he takes the hit. He's convicted, 25 to life for murder. And everyone thinks that's it. He's gone. But his wife, Sissy's still out on the street, and she's very close to Billy Boken, who was the guy with the wig on that did the
Right.
shooting. That's her childhood friend from the neighborhood. And she goes to, this is pretty fascinating because Mickey Featherstone and Sissy come forward to the prosecutors and say, Mickey didn't do this murder, and we think we can prove it. And the prosecutors say, nice try. We're not going to believe that shit unless you come up with some evidence, verifiable evidence that we can
Right.
use, like a recording, like an secret audio recording.
Right.
So Sissy wears a wire, arranges a meeting with Billy Boken at the 9th Avenue Food Festival in Hell's Kitchen, which is a big annual event there. And outdoors, she gets him to start talking about what happened. You were looking like, you wore a wig to look like Mickey, and Boken on tape admits everything.
Right.
And they take this to the prosecutors, and the unthinkable happens. Mickey Featherstone's murder conviction is thrown out. But the only way they will do that is if he agrees to become an informant and testify on the stand against the gang. Now, Mickey Featherstone was considered the ultimate Westie, the personification of what it meant to be. He was a Vietnam vet who'd come back from Vietnam with some mental issues, mental health issues. He'd committed a number of crazy killings. He was found not guilty of one of them by reason of insanity. And Coonan befriends him. Coonan sees, I can use this kid,
Right.
This kid is valuable to me. And he becomes a mentor to Featherstone. And the first thing he's like, Mickey, you need to take a bath, every now and then. And you need to dress better, wear a blazer and shit. He really kind of like gives him an identity, cleans him up and says, stop being this street mongrel, it's all about how you present yourself. So Mickey Featherstone becomes his project, and they form a bond, this very, very tight bond. I mean, I remember the trial when Mickey's testifying, against the gang. It was incredibly dramatic. It really was sort of like this whole Irish-American historical thing being brought down in that moment. And it was very personal. It was very human. To me, is what made it such a great story. And I think it's why the book is still a book that people go back to, because it's about something larger than just that story of those criminals. But Sissy also had to testify at the trial, and she was the one that when Jimmy Cuna's defense lawyer asked Sissy, you know, why did this happen, and about a certain thing, and she said, Mickey loved Jimmy. Remember, the whole courtroom went silent. She said, Mickey loved Jimmy, and Jimmy knows that.
Wow.
Mickey loved Jimmy, and Jimmy knows that. And she looked right at him, and I remember Coonan not showing anything, but I'm like, wow, what a moment that was, because that really was people whose bond was formulated in the streets, you know, in the most extreme of criminal subculture situation. Yeah. And the fact that they were now turning against each other and betraying each other in that way was a very powerful thing to see.
Yeah. And what became of Mickey, to your knowledge? He goes into the witness protection program, and
I stayed in touch with him for quite a while, probably for about 20 years. Followed what was going on with him and his family. You know, everyone believed that he was going to backslide immediately.
Yeah, I would have thought that myself.
Every cop I ever talked to, anyone ever, because that was his legend. Right. You can't tame him. He's a wild horse that can't be tamed. That whatever environment you put him in. I mean, the phrase that people would always repeat to me is, you know, the leopard doesn't change his spots or whatever. All the cliches you can think of were applied to him. That, as far as I know, it never happened. And he went on to have a very strong family life. And I didn't just get it from him. I was also talking to the FBI agent who was sort of overseeing him in the program, and people who had awareness of his life. And he completely kind of turned it around. Sissy, he became a house husband. Sissy had a job and went out and started to make the money. He raised the kids. His oldest kid, Mickey Jr., went into the army and was in, I think it was Iraq, one of the early invasions of Iraq, and was kind of a war hero, and then became a cop later. Wow. Yeah, it was kind of like a story that no one would believe, the way he kind of turned things around.
What was the better of the two Irish gangs, the NYPD, right? Or, you know,
yeah.
But that's amazing. Would you have thought that?
I wasn't that surprised, because you got to remember, first of all, I never was out on the streets with Mickey Featherstone. I never saw the Mickey Featherstone.
Right. You know him different.
You know, I never went out drinking with him in a bar. I never saw him that way.
You know him on his road to redemption,
I know him on his road to recovery. So I was taken in all those hours of interview time I had with him, that how thoughtful he was about what had happened. And I got the impression that he was being thoughtful about it for the first time in his life. It was this process of having to testify, and they're preparing him for that. He had to talk about the deepest, darkest secrets in his life. You know, then we cut the body up, and then we chopped his head off, and, you know, all this kind of stuff. He's having to talk about it, and he felt tremendous shame about it. They said he went through a process of crying about it a lot. It was really a cathartic process for him. So by the time I got to him, he was a different man in some ways than he was when he was that guy out on the streets. Right. And he was reflecting about it. And he was curious about it. Like, wow, I was that way. Why was I that way? He said he wasn't healthy. He knew that. He had really serious emotional problems. And the way they dealt with it a lot back then was to put you on Thorazine, which was called a liquid straitjacket. You know, just knock you out. Control you. And he said that was bad for him. That put him into like a dark place where he was barely able to be cognizant about things that he was doing. And there were a number of murders. There was at least one barroom murder that he committed where he was heavily drugged up on Thorazine. it was like a dream the way it happened. Some guy insulted him. Somebody put a gun. He took the gun and he shot a guy. Crazy, stupid murder with lots of witnesses. He said, I don't even remember most of that.
And he beat that with an insanity plea, I think, right?
Yeah,
Didn't
that was the one he beat with an insanity plea.
Which was pretty much on the money, if you think about it. You know?
Yeah, nobody would argue with that verdict at that time. So, about him staying on the clean and narrow, I think that his relationship with his wife, Sissy, who was also from the neighborhood, who had grown up in a very traumatic family situation where like 5 out of her 11 siblings had died from suicide or murder. She was also a Hell's Kitchen product. When they made the decision to cooperate, their relationship became almost a heroic firewall against the world. And they became so, that bond of that couple, and then I think their family, when they kind of went in the witness protection, was so incredibly strong, almost kind of unusually strong because of the extreme situations that were forcing them in this direction, that I wasn't that surprised. I saw that they were capable, those two together were capable of doing almost whatever they put their mind to.
Wow. Let's talk about real quick, Kevin Kelly and Kenny Shannon.
Did you ever have any encounters with those guys?
No,
Because they were the next generation.
They were. They were older than me, but yes, next generation. I think Kenny Shannon was actually an Upper East Side guy, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And
Yorktown.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a lot of tough kids up in Yorktown, too.
Jimmy Cagney's from there.
Oh, is he really?
Yeah.
Yeah, they were kind of running things when Coonan and Featherstone were away to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I guess Coonan and Featherstone were away for a 4 or 5 year period on gun charges and counterfeiting.
Yeah.
And Kevin Kelly was supposed to be a pretty rough guy. He ended up, I know there was one incident supposedly where he tied a guy to a tree and pulled his pants down and was, beating him in public over a debt, doing things that were kind of outlandish.
I'll tell you one that's even more twisted than that.
Well, go ahead. I'm not going to stop you.
Since we're here, Kevin Kelly and Kenny Shannon were into cocaine and selling it. They sort of went where the Westies hadn't gone before, and maybe you can't argue with it. That was the way you made money on the streets in the 80s. Now we're into the 80s, and they're younger guys, and they take over when Coonan and Featherstone are gone, and they're wild. So what they did is they got a guy who owed them money or something and wasn't paying, or he was selling coke in their territory. That's what it was. He was selling coke in their territory. They went and they kidnapped the guy, put him in the back seat of a car with Kevin Kelly on one side and Kenny Shannon on the other side, and they pulled down their pants and they jerked off all over him.
It's another bad taste moment in Westies history.
It's a weird form of intimidation.
Do you plan that out? You say this is what
they did. They must have planned it out. I'm amazed that they, in the heat of that moment, they were able to produce.
Yeah.
I guess it turned them on in some weird kind of way. Anyway, it's a very weird, sick moment, and it shows you that you take a criminal subculture and you allow it to function, it will devolve.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It will get sicker and sicker.
Yeah.
This was true in Boston with Whitey Bulger and that whole thing too. I mean, the level of depravity, if you're allowed to get away with it over time, the level of depravity will keep pushing the envelope and getting sicker and sicker and worse.
Yeah.
And that's what Kevin Kelly and Kenny Shannon represented. Now, I know people who did time with Kevin Kelly and they liked him.
Yeah, a guy, Anthony Ruggiano, was here a couple of weeks ago, and they were cellmates for a few years, and he thought he was the greatest guy in the world.
Yeah.
Said he was the real deal, He was a legitimate tough guy.
Nice guys make the best killers.
And two nice guys.
Although the
incident-
guy who was getting ejaculated on might take issue with me referring to him as a nice
Yeah.
guy.
Well, he'll remain nameless in this story. When I was going to St. Agnes, there was a story going around, and it was never verified, so I'm not going to put the names out there. But some kids from the West Side, Westie kids, would come to school. They would take the 57th Street crosstown bus over and come down 2nd Avenue. And they noticed that this rich kid would come out of one of the high-rises on the corner of 57th and 2nd, and a car would pull up like a limo to take the kid to school. So they with that Westie, know-how, they've decided, well, we'll grab him one day, and we'll put him back on the bus, take him back to the West Side, and we'll hold on to him for some money. So apparently they do this, and they take the kid and they put him in a closet and they duct tape the closet shut. They make some ridiculous demand for money on the phone, and as cover they go to school. And while they're in school, the kid gets out of the closet, and the Maris brothers and the Bulls come in and yanked him out, and that was the end of their shot at that. So I don't know if it was ever confirmed. It happened before I was there, but I thought it was funny in that this was going to be like, you don't just start off with like petty crime. You go right to the kidnapping phase,
It's a sad thought, but I think that's like how you grew up. When you grew up in a criminal subculture, that's how you grow up, because your uncle did it or your father did it, and so you think it's cool. And
and years later, I was working in the 10th Squad, and which covers Chelsea, which is kind of like Hell's Kitchen South.
Yes.
And my partner says, "Hey, listen, a guy is locked up in Midtown North on a hotel burglary, and he wants to give up a homicide. I'm going to go up." So I was processing my prisoner, and he comes back later. He goes, "Hey, did you ever hear these Spillane kids?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, I said, "I went to high school with them. They were, a couple of in different grades around me. One was in my grade." He goes, "Well, yeah, they had some kind of beef over in the buildings on 43rd Street, Manhattan Plaza. And it was one of Eddie Coonan's guys who was selling drugs. He comes to the apartment. There's a beef over it. And he ends up getting stabbed up, dies. They put him in a tub, they put ice on him. And at the end of the weekend, when the mother is coming home, I believe, they decide to just throw the body out off the balcony. And when it hits the car, it's initially thought that it's a suicide. And anyway, this guy gets arrested for the bank burglary and wants to give it up. And we actually used my St. Agnes yearbook so that they could do identifications. Now, the case went nowhere. There was no corroboration. But it was one or more of the Spillanes and a kid, Tommy Beza, and I forget the other.
This is a true story.
Yes.
I know it
Yeah.
because I've talked to one of the Spillanes about it, and I've heard different versions of it. The victim was a guy named Henny Diaz.
Yes.
Henny Diaz. Now what I heard was they had him in the tub, and they were trying to figure out how to get rid of the body.
Right.
Because they were on the upper floors, somewhere around the 35th floor or something.
Yeah.
And this is a time when they were all using cocaine and getting high and shit. So they one day where they all got sick of looking at this body in the tub. They'd been there for like 4 or 5 days. One of them decided, hey, let's just throw it out the fucking window. You can't pin it on us, And that's what they did. And they apparently they almost hit a pizza delivery man who was walking along the street.
He's got
with
a good
pizza.
He's got a good story for the rest of his life.
And the body hit the car like right next to him, scared the shit out of him. And
yeah, and what was funny is me and Bobby were dating these 2 Italian girls. They were cousins at the same time. And so I actually had seen Bobby. I didn't really know Bobby in high school. So we had gone out with these girls a few times. And so there was something like a familiar kind of relationship with each other. So I said, listen, I don't want to hear any more about it. And I gave him my yearbook, and that was the end of that. But unfortunately, Bobby passed not too long ago.
Yes.
By falling. He fell out a window waving to his brother, or I don't know if...
There's more to that story, too.
Was it a drug thing or a...
It was quite possibly some form of suicide, is what it was.
Yeah.
He threw himself out the window.
Wow.
He's in a state of it was not easy growing up in that neighborhood, man.
No, and that traumatic incident as a child.
Yeah. It's funny. Bobby Spillane, when the book The Westies came out, it kind of rattled that entire West Side culture. Like nobody knew who I was. When I wrote that book, I was not Jimmy Breslin or Michael Daly. I was not a big name journalist.
Right.
And that was fine with me because I was able to do the book kind of quietly without anyone really knowing who I was or what I was up to. So when the book came out, it was like kind of a sensation within the West Side culture. It was like, who's this guy? And where did this come from? And how does he have all this inside stuff? And the Spillanes didn't like it because they didn't like having their father associated with the Westies and all that history. So they resented it. And I imagine in some ways it was hard for them. And I'm very sensitive to this. A book comes out and other people are reading it. And in many ways, the people you're writing about have to answer for that book.
Right.
People start coming up to them and asking them questions. And so they become kind of resentful about the book. The Spillane family, I was not a name that was said amongst the Spillane family with any great feelings of enthusiasm, although I had no beefs with any of them, but it was like, so, but I knew a lot of people who knew Bobby. And so I requested a sit down with Bobby Spillane. I said, can you arrange for me to meet with Bobby Spillane? This was years after the book had come out. And I sat down with him, and I could see, man, this was like, he was tense. This was kind of like a big thing for him. I'm in the room with TJ English, and do I want to strangle this guy or what? And I started by saying, look, I apologize. I'm sorry if this book caused distress for your family and the people in your family. I have tremendous respect for your father in a lot of ways because of the role he played in the community, in the neighborhood. I'm well aware of that.
Right.
I know he wasn't one of the Westies. He's not someone who was cutting up bodies and involved in all that depravity. And so we buried the hatchet, talked, and even became friends after that. Now, some of his siblings still didn't want to be in the same room with me, but he took it upon himself to formulate a relationship with me to when I wrote a follow-up book called Paddywhacked, and I retread some of this history, particularly about Mickey Spillane in that book, Paddywhacked. Bobby gave me some incredible stuff, including that story I told you about him being the child who went to the intercom and said, hey, Dad, there's somebody here for you. Yeah. So Bobby opened up to me and shared a lot of stuff. But yeah, that's one of the things about writing these kind of true crime accounts. There's a residue to it, and you're putting it into a book and you're putting it out in public, and it behooves you to give some thought to that you're writing about real human beings, and this book is going to have an impact on their lives. And in some ways, there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, I wasn't going to alter what I write about them because of that, but it helps to be sensitive about it, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's Bobby and Denise, the two other siblings in that family, opened bar restaurants.
There's
in the
one there
neighborhood.
now called Mickey Spillane's.
Yeah.
It's on like 9th Avenue and 53rd Street or something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and then finally the McManus era came to an end with the death of, which I'm trying to remember. Jim, who was the last surviving member of it, and he passed a few years back, not that long ago.
Yes.
And, so it's the end of an era, and I hear recently that Coonan is getting close to possibility of parole.
Yes.
Could be in like the next 5 years or so. He keeps getting turned down.
Yeah.
But, I think he maxes out. So,
but he's at that stage where I think it's every 2 years he goes before the board and they revisit it.
What do you think would happen if he stepped out into the world? I mean, an older man, what do you think it would be like to be him? You know, you come out in this world. I mean, it's just kind of bizarre that this era is almost forgotten at this point by a large part of the public. You know?
I don't think there's any risk that someone like that would get back involved in. First of all, that world is so far gone now.
Yeah.
So there's nothing there for him.
I was thinking more, how do you live out your days? You know, it's just obviously anything is better than prison, but just to come out, and it must be just so bizarre. You know, before technology, you go in, you come out, you're 80 years old or whatever it is. You know, it's...
The thing is with the Westies and those guys, so many of those murders and crimes were impulse crimes. Jimmy Coonan had a temper that he couldn't control.
Yeah.
And so a number of the killings were fly off the handle and kill somebody kind of killings, you know? Now, I've known some ornery old men in my life that I would be happy they didn't have a gun on them. Crotchety old guys,
Right.
fly off the handle.
Right.
So I don't know. Unlike Mickey Featherstone, Jimmy Coonan, I believe, is a guy who had a lot of malice. Some people call it evil. I don't know about that. I don't use that word. I try not to use that word. But he had malice in him. He was probably certainly a sociopath, maybe even a psychopath.
Yeah.
How else do you explain, killing somebody and cutting up the body like that?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking before about when we were talking about owning Madden, probably starting a gang that would eventually be called the Westies, at least handed down into
Yes.
different forms. One thing I was thinking about owning is that George Raft, the actor, was actually his driver for a good period
Oh,
of
they
time.
were close. George Raft is from Hell's Kitchen.
Yeah.
And they were buddies. Supposedly, Raft was a member of the Gopher gang.
Gopher gang, right.
When Madden was in charge of that gang. He was the boss of that gang.
Yeah.
They were very tight. In fact, that whole George Raft, for those who don't know, and there's probably a lot of people who have no idea who that is. It's kind of a forgotten character. But he's a big movie star in the 30s.
Right.
And he always played gangsters in the movies.
Right.
He was kind of the Joe Pesci of his day. And he was really popular, and he was kind of elegant, suave guy. And he was from Hell's Kitchen, and he brought an aesthetic presentation, the way he dressed and the way he carried himself, that was kind of the Hell's Kitchen style.
Right.
And supposedly Jimmy Cagney befriended Raft and got his whole persona from getting to know George Raft.
Right.
Yeah, George Raft him and Oni Madden were tight.
Yeah. I was thinking of a funny story Mike Daly actually told me, that there was a restaurant owner in the 40s.
I know this. I know this story.
Yeah, you correct me if I'm wrong.
Olson, he's still there, that guy. And the restaurant's still there.
Is this a story where he calls Midtown North Precinct?
Yeah.
He calls the Midtown North Precinct
Yeah.
and says, hey, these guys want money, He says, yeah. He goes, well, what's the guy's name? So he says, Jimmy Coonan. What should I do? Pay him.
Yeah.
So
I heard that story. In fact, I met Olson. I tried to interview Olson for the book when I was writing it, and he wouldn't talk to me.
can't say I blame him, right?
Yeah. But then years later, I met him. I'm like, you wouldn't talk to me. He says, yeah, I can talk to you now. And he told me that story from his point of view.
And it was good advice. Because,
Pretty good.
precinct detectives can't protect you from the future and.
You get that with cops a lot. Like, I had a friend of mine once who got...
Well, most cops would probably talk you into cooperating because they wanted the arrest.
I had a friend one time who got he was getting off a subway, somebody stole his briefcase. A guy stole his briefcase and had money in it, and he saw the guy who stole it. And he had real good visuals of look of the guy. And he called up the cops, local precinct, and told them about it. And they assigned a detective to it. And then a few days later, the guy sees the guy who stole his briefcase. He sees him on the street. And he calls the cops, and he said, the guy's in front of this store. I've seen him. He's there now. I see the guy. And this is what the guy told me anyway. He said, the cop said to him, well, you do what you got to do. I thought that's such a New York bit of advice, right?
Yeah.
If you're a real man, you take matters in your own hands and you do what you got to do. Don't expect us to come over there and clean up the situation.
Yeah, he was.
Now you wouldn't.
He was deputized.
Cops today would not. Yeah. That would not be acceptable.
No. We would all be fired. Wow. Well, and I guess the Cipollines who are there now, they're the last. That's it. When they go, that's the end of it.
It's pretty much gone completely anyway.
Well, I meant just like the last kind of. It's the last
link. Yeah, the last link to that era. But basically, I mean, it's not an Irish neighborhood. Most of the old school people were forced out by gentrification. It's mostly a gay neighborhood now. It's kind of like the gay neighborhood from the West Village moved up to Chelsea, and then it moved up to Hell's Kitchen.
I think Mickey Spillane's bar actually gets a lot of gay clientele
I
too.
imagine so.
Yeah.
In that neighborhood. There's no criminal rackets really that I know of. I mean, this is America and it's New York, so there's probably something going on there. Somebody sells the cocaine in the neighborhood.
The real criminal racket is how much stagehands are paid. it's the one career I should have taken when I was a kid.
That was controlled by, that was a union, Theatrical Union 870. That's one of the things the Westies control, got a piece of. That and the Longshoremen's Association.
Yeah, I mean, well, then they basically ran New York out of the unloading business.
Oh, they priced them out?
Well, just the amount of money they stole
Yeah.
from those. Nothing was safe coming off those ships.
Yeah.
A lot of things got legs.
Well, that's basically the price of the mob having their hooks into so many aspects of business in New York City that it eventually became untenable like that. No longer, it was like a tax that everyone was, and if you were going to make them pay that, then they'd just go to some other city. New York was losing business because of that.
Yeah. Well, the mob followed it over to Jersey anyway. So, well, listen, hey, thank you so much for doing this. It's almost like a last minute thing. I found out you were coming, and I was like, I mean, I think I read that book about 5 times when it came out.
That's the first book I published. I was a 30-year-old kid when I wrote that book. Yeah. It's never been out of print. It's the book I recently later this year I'm publishing my 10th book.
Wow.
But the Westies is the one that people always talk about and come up to me and ask me questions about it. It's had amazing staying power that way.
It had a big impact on my life because of my connection through school, through work.
Yeah.
Meeting, members of Mickey's family over the years, and but the story is just so, intense.
It's an iconic New York City story, right? It's almost like essential history. You kind of have to know about that to understand the psyche, certainly of the Irish American process in New York. And also just the way the city was, that there was a time when that was New York City.
Yeah. You picked a good time to move to New York, right?
I moved there in 81, yeah. Well, for about 30 or 40 years there, New York was on a downward decline. It was kind of like wherever you checked in on that. It was... This city's going down the toilet, and you're along for the ride, basically.
You had a good another 15 years or so to go before it came back up, right?
Yeah, but when I drove a cab in the mid-'80s, like 84, 85, 86, like I said, those are the crack cocaine years, and that's when the homicide rate every year was really spiraling. Yeah. And those were like crazy in-the-street homicides, a lot of them, drug-related stuff. You driving a cab, being around the city in general, you heard gunfire frequently, in the streets in New York. I mean, the level of violence was palpable, like it was out there, like the kind of energy, the energy in the streets. You could, because Brooklyn and all these places hadn't been gentrified yet. So they were all like, Brooklyn was like one big no-go zone, pretty much.
You didn't even want to go to Park Slope at that time.
No, Brooklyn Heights maybe, and then that was it.
Right.
And Bushwick, Brooklyn, which is now like one of the hippest, coolest neighborhoods. Yeah. That someone to just say Bushwick and it would send chills up my spine.
They originally called it Williamsburg East to get people to move
I know, they're trying to call it that now. Bushwick was terrifying because it was the center of the crack trade.
Yeah.
But I gotta say, to be honest with you, that's probably one of the things that drew me to New York.
Yeah, and how many of us long for the Times Square of old?
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to just go back for a day.
Yeah.
Walk around 42nd Street.
I mean, the city was gritty, and to live in it, you had to have street smarts.
Right.
And you were kind of proud of that you were able to navigate that city at that time. And again,
Yeah.
this thing about swagger that I was talking about. Now any old soft fool can live in New York.
Right.
I mean, I see people on the subway. I want to mug them.
Yeah.
They're so unaware. They got their phones out. A woman's got a purse there. It's like stuff you never would have done in the 70s.
Yeah, no one's going to help you because they're too busy getting they want to get the shot on the phone.
Yeah. So you don't have to really have that swagger anymore.
So TJ and I are both involved in this Irish Fest. We're going to do something later on in beautiful Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I wish we had more time. And you have a short time here.
Yeah.
Maybe you come back and we talk about some of the other.
I'll be back.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I'll be back.
I'd love to have you back and, show you more of Tulsa. There's some really cool things to do here. It's a town that's it's kind of won my heart over. And it was great to finally meet you after all these years. And
well, thanks for doing this and being so knowledgeable about this subject and this history and everything. It makes it a pleasure to talk about it.
I wish Joe Coffey could have been here. He was
Joe Coffey.
But
Publicity Joe.
Yes, but Joe knew his stuff. Right?
He was a very
He's a political guy.
Yeah, but he was a very charismatic guy.
Yeah.
And when I met him to interview him, again, for those who don't know, he was a legendary homicide detective in New York. And when I met him to interview him for the book, like I said, I was a 30-year-old kid, and he was this legend in the NYPD. But he decided he was going to talk to me, and so he put on the full Joe Coffey presentation when I met him. I was kind of bowled over by him, and that's by design. I mean, Joe was kind of impressing me with his charisma and his knowledge, and just old school guy. But then I wrote the book, and I didn't defame him or anything, but I gave the point of view of the Westies about Joe Coffey, about how they thought he was a big blowhard and that they called him Publicity Joe, and they thought he was trying to manufacture shit about them, And so Joe wasn't that happy when the book came out.
Yeah.
I remember he said, "You made me look," he said, "I really like the book. It's really well written, but you made me look like an asshole." Right. And I'm like, well, Joe, that's because a lot of people think you're an asshole.
Right. Well, again, I really enjoyed it, going back on this one. It was great. And there's so many people in the true crime genre that really wanted to hear this and hear us talk about it. And we're definitely got to do this again. This would be great. And we'll get you out here and get it done. And thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. And it's called The Proffer. Hit like, subscribe, ring the bell, and all that good stuff. And TJ, once again, thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot, man.
All right, pal.
It was my pleasure. Over and out.